I found a story this week from a man named Patrick J. Wilson. He tells of a friend of his who began his first year of ministry at a small Presbyterian church in Aberdeen, Mississippi. During his first year, he was contacted by three men who were asking about one of the members of his church, an elderly woman who lived alone. They wanted to see how she was doing, if people were visiting her, if there was anything about her house that needed attention, so on and so forth. Once a year, every year, the three men would fly to Aberdeen. One of them was from California, another from Oklahoma, and a third from New Jersey. They hired someone to care for her lawn. They contracted someone when her house needed repairs, or while they were there, they just did the work themselves. They brought her presents. They did just about anything that they could to make her life easier and more comfortable. Why, you might be asking? During World War II, these three men were soldiers. They were on the ground floor of a house in Normandy just days after D-Day. While they were in the house, a German grenade came bouncing down the stairs. A fourth man who was there threw himself on top of that grenade, and his sacrifice saved those three soldiers. That man who gave his life was this woman's husband. After the war, those three men started making their way to Mississippi every year, wanting to make sure they provided her with everything they possibly could. They had been doing that for decades when this new pastor arrived at her church. Now, isn't that a wonderful story of gratitude? But there's actually one more little catch to this story. There were a total of 18 soldiers in that house the day the grenade went off. All of them were spared by the actions of that one man. Now, this isn't to say that the other 15 weren't grateful for his actions, but 3 of them went out of their way to show it. 3 out of 18, 16.67% of the people in that house. Furthermore, a 2018 study from a group of researchers from the Journal of Royal Society Open Science focused on how often people in social settings expressed gratitude when they received a service, assistance, or just something they needed. The study focused on speakers of 18 different languages and took place by observing casual social situations across 5 continents. English speakers scored the highest in this study by saying thank you the most, so yay for us. The bad news, we only said it about 14.5% of the time. Not a great stat. It's even less great when we look at this in the light of how much importance we place on showing gratitude. We teach our kids from a very young age to say please and thank you. And yet we have a study here that shows we don't say it quite as often as we think we do. Now, some of the languages in this study naturally place less importance on expressing thanks. Some of them don't even have a phrase as simple as our thank you, and so they place less emphasis on saying this after every social interaction where they benefited from someone else's kindness. We may find this rude, but the idea in some cultures is that it's more of a duty to be hospitable to others, and so there's less need to acknowledge something that should be done anyway. Now, this is fine for speakers of a language that don't commonly make allowance for expressing thanks in every situation. And it goes a long way towards explaining why gratitude might be statistically lower in those languages than it was in English. But for us as English speakers, a language that does give us a way, many ways actually, to express our appreciation for people that aid us, and as people that do place some degree of importance on expressing said appreciation, I personally think that us showing up at 14.5% on a study like this is a little bit embarrassing. However, one thing that these examples show us is that there are still messages in our gospel that we can learn from. Specifically today, we're going to look at the book of Luke, chapter 17, verses 11 through 19. Now, on his way to Jerusalem, Jesus traveled along the border between Samaria and Galilee. As he was going into a village, 10 men who had leprosy met him. They stood at a distance and called out in a loud voice, "Jesus, Master, have pity on us." When he saw them, he said, "Go, show yourselves to the priests." And as they went, they were cleansed. One of them, when he saw he was healed, came back, praising God in a loud voice. He threw himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him, and he was a Samaritan. Jesus asked, "Were not all 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9? Has no one returned to give praise to God except this foreigner?" Then he said to him, "Rise and go. Your faith has made you well." 1 out of 10 isn't great either. But guess what? It's not all that different from 14.5%. It's also not too far away from 16.67%. Clearly, there are some commonalities between today and those times so long ago. Let's take a look at this story a little more closely. One thing we should understand before we get into this is that Jesus is traveling, and where he happens to be is on the border between Samaria and Galilee. So he's in a region where it would be likely that he will start to encounter more of a mixture of Jews and Samaritans, being that he is naturally closer to Samaria. One more thing that we should understand is the rift between Jews and Samaritans. We see this often in the New Testament, and the reasons for this feud are numerous, and we would be here for a while listing them all before I ever got to my point, and nobody wants that. But let's think about this. Have you ever heard how fans of one football team can talk about the city and even the people of a rival city? Let's say, since we're geographically near Pittsburgh, that we could consider ourselves Steelers fans. And if you're not, just go with me for a second. Have you ever heard Steelers fans talking about a city like, I don't know, let's pick one at random. How about Cleveland? Have you heard a diehard Pittsburgh fan talk about Cleveland, that dirty city with those fans? Think about that, but then add political and religious disagreements, and we can start to see how the Jews and Samaritans saw each other. We can also start to see why Jesus so often ministered to Samaritans and why he used them as examples for loving our neighbor rather than fearing them, condemning them, and ignoring them. But anyway, back to our story. Jesus is approaching a village, and he is stopped by 10 men with leprosy. They call out to him from a distance, "Jesus, Master, have pity on us." They are desperate for help. Now, leprosy, like I told the kids, is still around today, but it's curable for us. Back then, however, it was not a good thing to come down with. When it's not treated, leprosy leads to permanent physical damage to the nervous system, to the skin, the eyes, and the limbs. And since this is a communicable disease, those affected by it were also treated as outcasts. Jesus ministering to the lepers is yet another example of him reaching people that society said we should forget. But Jesus does heal them. He tells them to go to the priests, and on their way, the 10 men find that they are cleansed. Their leprosy is healed. And of those 10 men, how many came back to say thank you? Just the one. 1 out of 10. And not only did he come back, he comes back with pure joy. He's praising God in a loud voice, surely causing a ruckus. And the Bible tells us he didn't merely bow down to Jesus, he threw himself at Jesus' feet. He's praising loudly, and he so desperately needs to thank Jesus that he throws himself down in front of him. And you know what's funny? Is the one that came back was a Samaritan, one of those other people. Now, we don't know where the other 9 men were from, but I think we can infer that at least one of them were not, more than one of them were not foreigners, because Jesus literally picks him out of the group, saying the foreigner was the only one who came back to praise God. Lest we forget, that one man got the double-decker of odds being stacked against him. Not only was he a Samaritan, he was a Samaritan with leprosy. So if any one of those 10 men had a reason to maybe get their healing and get out of there, it was probably him. But yet his need to praise God and his need to thank Jesus brings him back. Maybe I'm misreading this a little bit, but I read Jesus' response here to this as somewhat humorous. I almost read some befuddlement from Jesus here. He says, we're not all 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9? To me, it's almost like he's saying, wait a minute. The healing worked, right? You all got healed. It's only you that came back? But Jesus gives this man a blessing. He tells him to rise and go. His faith has made him well. I think this story leaves us with one question. Are we one of the 9, or are we the one that comes back? Do we get what we need and go on our merry way, or do we take time to let God know just how thankful we are? I found another story this week. This from James W. Moore. His story is about his granddaughter Sarah, who was 2 years old at the time. Sarah takes a break from playing and heads into the kitchen to look for a snack. Her mother is in the kitchen, and Sarah asks her for a banana. Sarah's mother gives her one, and Sarah, in a hurry to get back to playing, starts to rush out the kitchen. But before she got too far, Sarah's mother calls out behind her, "Sarah, come back." What are the magic words? Sarah stops in her tracks. She turns around, and not wanting to miss one of the magic words, she blurts out, "Please, thank you, you're welcome, God bless you, I love you, Mommy." It's a lot of gratitude right there. Maybe Sarah says more than she needs to, and maybe it's a little loud and forceful, but the spirit of her gratitude transcends all the rest of it, doesn't it? Just like the loud and forceful gratitude of the Samaritan who came back. I don't think any of us here ever intentionally forget to give our thanks to God. I'm not so sure that those other 9 men that day neglected to come back to Jesus out of any ill intent. I would imagine they were so caught up in the miracle that they experienced, the new life that they were given, that they just got swept up in the moment. We all experience that. What the example of that one Samaritan shows us is how to be intentionally thankful and intentionally grateful for the blessings we are given. It's easy for us to cry out to God in our time of need. It was easy for all those 10 men to see Jesus and to call out for him to have pity on them. We can be loud when we need something from God. We can throw ourselves at Jesus' feet when we need him. What the Samaritan teaches us is how to do the same when things are going wonderfully for us. This is an example of how to be joyous, how to be thankful, and in the midst of that joy and thankfulness, or perhaps because of it, take time to share that praise for our God. 10% of the men with leprosy, 14.5% of English speakers, and 16.67% of the soldiers in that house in Normandy, none of which ever crossed that threshold of 20%, never reaching that second person out of 10. Imagine if we all tried to be one person out of 10. And the more people who tried to be one person out of 10, the closer we get to not being 1 out of 10 anymore. Then we start being 2 out of 10, or 3, or 4. What if we were 10 out of 10? What if we were all joyous, loud about our praise for God? If we all took the time to show our gratitude, how much would we change? How much more joyous would we be? How much would the world change? We do have so very much to be thankful for, and I know that there are times when it doesn't feel like it. But even in those times, we can praise God. So don't forget to be loud. Sing those words of thanks to God. Don't forget to throw yourself at Jesus' feet, but to do so out of love, a need to be close to him, and a need to just say thank you. Don't forget to be that one person out of 10. And all of God's people said,